Just to start out, thank you all for being here. My name is Luke Hamill. I'm the president of the CE Plus student organization here at the UVA Architecture School. I'm joined by my co-hosts Bernardo and Julie, who are also officers. We're here to present to you Dr. Andrew Ramey from Carnegie Mellon University, who's come to speak to us about conservation and policy in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Dr. Ramey earned his PhD in history in 2015 from CMU. He has taught numerous courses in the history department and won the department's 2015 Goldman Award for excellence in graduate student teaching. Prior to joining the history department as an academic advisor, Andrew worked for the Pittsburgh Schweitzer Fellows Program, where he helped graduate students implement direct service projects to address health and environmental justice in underserved communities in southwestern Pennsylvania. Andrew is passionate about helping students succeed both inside and outside the classroom. And with that, I would like to turn it over to the talent. Take it away, Andrew.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone, for being here. It's really a pleasure to get to spend some time with you all and talk about the Chesapeake Bay. I do some teaching here at Carnegie Mellon, where I'm the academic advisor for the history department. And a lot of my teaching involves intro-level history classes, which are fun. I love preaching the good news about history at a tech school, but it is fun to kind of dig deeper into something that's more my area of expertise. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, kick us off. I will talk for about 40 to 45 minutes if I don't get too carried away in my own thoughts. And then I'd love to have a robust Q&A, because one of the things I love most about studying environmental history, about asking these questions about the relationship between people and nature over time, is that it's so inherently interdisciplinary. It requires so many perspectives to understand what's going on. So I hope to show you a little bit how I, as a historian, see this issue, these issues, and what the perspective of the past can bring. But I know we've got a great group of people here, and I hope to learn from your own unique perspectives as well. So without further delay, let me begin. All right, so as Luke said with that lovely introduction, my name is Andrew Ramey. I am at Carnegie Mellon University here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It's a gloomy, gray day outside. We get a lot of those, but the plus side is I'm not going to be washed out with too much sunlight. So the title of my talk today is Watershed Moments, pun intended, on the Chesapeake Bay and its watershed. So watershed moments, the advocacy, policy, and science behind the Chesapeake Bay's recovery. So the topic today is our nation's greatest estuary, the Chesapeake Bay. And one of the things that people actually don't realize is the Chesapeake Bay has been the subject of one of the longest running state and federal ecosystem restoration projects in the world, and also one of the most expensive. Since 1983, combined state, federal, local, and private sources have conservatively spent over $30 billion trying to restore the Bay, with mixed results. Some of the largest amount of funding has come in the past 10 years, about half the total. So there's a recent spike. And one of my goals today is to explain how we get here. Historians can get in trouble when we stray too far into the present, but I still hope to bring us fairly close to the present day and explore how the history of the movement got us here. Just for some context, the Everglades is often cited as one of the largest restoration efforts in the country. Indeed, it is. But in comparison, the comprehensive Everglades restoration program has a price tag of around $10 billion. So, a third of the Bay. Another point of comparison, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, that's about $4 billion over the past 10 years. So significant projects, no doubt, but they don't hold a candle to the Chesapeake Bay. So this sheer amount of money alone makes the Chesapeake Bay a supremely important site to examine American environmental policy at both the state and federal level. And that's before we even consider the fact that the Chesapeake is such a supremely important body of water with unparalleled cultural, historic, economic, and of course, ecological significance. So I've structured my talk today in a somewhat conventional way for a historian, 5 watershed moments that bring us from the very early origins of this movement to somewhat close to the present day. We'll start in 1966 and work our way up to 2010. The image I include here on the right is a satellite image taken from 1997. It is one of my favorites because it encapsulates the whole bay, but you can also see Pittsburgh, which is where I'm currently based. And down here at the bottom, it has this great little tagline. It's a little blurry, so I'll read it for you. 64,000 square miles of land, water, and people. And below that, a better bay through better science. Now, maybe I'm a bit sensitive to this, seeing as I'm a historian who works at a renowned tech institution at Carnegie Mellon. Maybe I'm too worried about fetishizing science and these issues, but I don't think so. As we've seen time and time and again, expertise, scientific judgment is not enough, whether it's climate change or public health. Simply having the facts and having a scientific expert consensus doesn't get the job done. You need a social movement, a political movement to go along with it. And so that's what these 5 watershed moments encapsulate. We'll talk a little bit about the science, and we'll hear from some of the key scientific figures of the Chesapeake Bay restoration movement. But we'll also look at the activists and the policymakers who make this a reality. I have a framed image of this poster in my office as a constant reminder that science alone isn't enough. It's especially valued. As a historian at a tech school, we got to have these reminders that what we do in the humanities, studying history, studying social science matters, as does understanding the built environment, people who do hydrological stuff, and I'm curious to hear who else is in the room. So this history can be told as a story of turning the Chesapeake Bay estuary into the Chesapeake Bay watershed. It's been so important to understand the relationship of the estuary to its watershed. So in some ways, this is a story of overcoming the bay's political ecology. The states of Maryland and Virginia have the estuary within their state borders, but the majority of the water comes from the north, from Pennsylvania, from New York, through the Susquehanna River. And that has presented an ongoing challenge that has really required federal intervention to solve. So this history will take us from a more fractured regional movement to a more unified movement with a strong role for the federal government. So without further delay, let me introduce you to our 5 watershed moments. I'll run through them very briefly because we will look at them much more closely in detail. First, the creation of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation in 1966. This is supremely important as the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, a group I hope many of you at least have some name recognition with, largest regional organization working on the Chesapeake Bay, the first to really tackle these issues head on. And while the ecosystem of environmental groups has grown significantly over the past 15, 20 years, for the majority of our story, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation is the leading advocacy group for the Bay, so they are very, very important. Our second watershed moment is Tropical Storm Agnes. Hopefully some of you might remember this, recall this pretty significant tropical storm that set a lot of rainfall records. We'll explore the impacts of that, but this is the event that shows the broader public that the Bay's in trouble and leads to a serious restoration movement, which gets its first key turning point in 1983. This is the first Chesapeake Bay Agreement. It's symbolic. The movement has a long way to go from the mid-1980s, but this is still a hugely important turning point where a coordinated regional effort begins, as opposed to Maryland and Virginia, throwing rocks at each other from across the Potomac, and Pennsylvania up north just kind of ignoring the whole thing. So this is a big turning point for actually getting everybody in the region moving in the right direction, albeit very, very slowly. So that slow effort picks up with another environmental disaster in 1997. There's this thing called Pfiesteria hysteria, where a mysterious toxic microorganism causes havoc in the bay. It ends up being not as big of a deal ecologically as people thought it would be, but it is a huge deal politically. So again, science, politics, we'll explore that. Finally, what this leads up to and where my talk will conclude is with the EPA's TMDL consent decree. This is total maximum daily load, TMDL, and this is the lawsuit and legal policy framework that's been governing the Bay's recovery, I'll call it that, for the past 10, 15 years. It's a really important turning point, and it's where my story ends because I think the ramifications of this are still unfolding. I don't want to speculate too much about the present day. I'm not a scientist. I'm happy to take questions about it in the Q&A though. So these are our checkpoints, about one each decade of the restoration movement. And those of you who are more familiar with Chesapeake Bay politics and history might note that I've pushed the origins of this pretty far back. And we'll talk about some of the conventional dating. Typically, when other scholars, journalists, and officials talk about the Chesapeake Bay, this is when they talk about the movement beginning. And I'm going to bump us back a few years before that. But before we get to all this history, I want to start with a piece of hate mail, because I think it's funny, but I also think it introduces us, like the Greeks, the great historians of Greek times, Homer, in media res, in the middle of the story. So I want to show you one of my favorite pieces of evidence from the archives as a jumping off point into the middle of this story, to take us right into the center of the action, and then we'll rewind and go through these in a more conventional chronological order. So in December 1980, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation got a piece of hate mail. They republished it in the CBF News in April 1981, which is where I came across it. And it's from this guy, Donald DeBoard from Westchester, PA, who is livid with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation for daring to ask him for money to help support the environment. And my favorite little bit comes right here at the end. He says, after venting his spleen, "So tell me, where do I sign up and donate to fight you jerks? I bet you're Democrats. Me and Ronnie are going to take care of you. Disgusted, Donald DeBoard." Right, like that's a fun thing. When you're in the archives and you're like digging through a bunch of dusty old papers, you get one of these, you're like, right on, that's fun. What's going on here? So those of you who guessed that Ronnie was one of Donald DeBoard's local drinking buddies, no, not some local tough guy from the local watering hole. Ronnie is the 40th president of these United States, Ronald Reagan. You might have expected Ronald Reagan to be somewhat of an anti-environmentalist based off of his campaign rhetoric, based off of things we popularly associate him with: cutting the EPA's budget, deregulation, small business, conservative icon. This makes sense, right? If you were Donald DeBoard in 1980, you would expect Ronald Reagan to take care of the environmentalists. But history often doesn't go quite the way we expect it to. So let me play a clip. Whoopsies. Let me play this clip. You might want to turn your volume up a little bit as you listen. I'll try to jack it up on my end. If I blow your eardrums out, I'm sorry, but here's Reagan giving his take. He briefly says something about space. Let me get to the good clip. His take on the environment, and in particular, the Chesapeake Bay.
Regulatory constraints, and with NASA's help, promote private sector investment in space. And as we develop the frontier of space, let us remember our responsibility to preserve our older resources here on Earth. Preservation of our environment is not a liberal or conservative challenge. It's common sense. Though this is a time of budget constraints, I have requested for EPA one of the largest percentage budget increases of any agency. We will begin the long necessary effort to clean up a productive recreational area and a special national resource, the Chesapeake Bay. We'll reduce the threat.
So I love this clip for so many reasons, but right there at the end, there's this clapping, and you can see Reagan go, ooh, like he wasn't quite expecting that. It's a hint. It's a hint of some things. How do we explain this? Was Reagan actually an environmentalist? Was the guy who said preservation of our environment is not a liberal or conservative challenge, it's common sense? Was he actually an environmentalist, and if historians and political scientists been like running his name through the muck these past 40 years? No, Reagan is not an environmentalist. Reagan is not a friend of the environment. But you can imagine the look on Donald DeBoard's face when he saw that State of the Union. What's going on here? Take care of the environmentalists, indeed. How can Reagan say this? Well, in part, he was able to brag about requesting a large percentage increase for the EPA because he had previously gutted it to such a low level that bringing some of the funding back still represented a large percentage increase. But there's a larger story here than just semantics. Why would Reagan support this? Why would he go against the expectations of so many of his supporters? Why would he be a crucial figure in creating the modern Chesapeake Bay program? Well, to explain that, we partially have to rewind. So in 1983, December, about a month before Reagan's State of the Union address, the governors of Maryland, Pennsylvania, Virginia, the Chesapeake Bay Commission, the EPA, and the city of DC signed the first Chesapeake Bay Agreement, where they acknowledged the Bay was in trouble. And here I quote, "We recognize that the findings of the Chesapeake Bay program have shown an historical decline in the living resources of the Chesapeake Bay, and that a cooperative approach is needed to fully address the extent, complexity, and sources of pollutants entering the bay." So this is our first watershed moment, even though it's the third chronologically, because you have regional consensus that the bay is in trouble. This document has been criticized by many scholars because it's voluntary and doesn't have a lot of enforcement mechanisms, and those are valid critiques. But as a historian, I want to point out, it was a minor miracle to get Pennsylvania to agree to this. It was a major miracle to get Maryland and Virginia to stop feuding over the Chesapeake Bay and start working towards it. And at the heart of it was a recognition that this special estuary, this amazing natural resource, was in serious trouble. This was something that scientists and resource users and activists had been lobbying for almost 20 years. So from the perspective of 2023, we can look back 40 years and say, big deal, the bay's in trouble. That's obvious to us now. It was obvious to people in the 80s, but it took a significant political movement to get the region's leadership to acknowledge it. And this groundswell of popular momentum that got these regional leaders to agree went all the way up to the White House. And Reagan, for whatever else he was a savvy politician who could get a sense of which way the political winds were blowing, and he hopped on the Chesapeake Bay bandwagon. It took a little bit of persuading. Happy to discuss that more in the Q&A. But he came around, was persuaded to include it in the State of the Union address. And as he kicked off his reelection campaign in 1984, the Chesapeake Bay became something of a example he could point to when he was challenged for his environmental record. He would say, "Oh no, I care about the Chesapeake Bay." And there's great video footage I have of him going out to Tillman Island in the bay and meeting with working watermen. And you can see Reagan loves it. He loves hardworking, rugged individualists. These are his type of people. So I don't doubt that there is also some degree of genuine empathy and concern for some of the working class folks in the bay. But by and large, this is a convenient political tool for him in his national campaign. So the Chesapeake Bay Agreement, very important inflection point for both regional and national politics. And here I'd like to briefly be political, as traumatizing as our national politics can be. It wasn't that long ago that, despite their differences, Republicans and Democrats actually worked together and did some positive things for the Bay. No, it wasn't perfect, but when we find ourselves being really discouraged about the present state of affairs, I think it's helpful to look to the past for guidance and for encouragement and for a reminder that not long ago, these things were possible. And if they were possible before, they can be possible again. I want to make one more quick point with this watershed moment before moving on. I harp on this because as a historian, I want to be very accurate about things. So if you pull up the Chesapeake Bay program's webpage today, they tell you that since their formation in 1983, there have been these multiple written agreements, and that the initial research findings, let me blow that up so you can see it. The initial research findings led to the formation of the Chesapeake Bay program as a means to restore the bay. Now, if you're a savvy listener of my talk, you'd say, wait a minute, didn't you just say in the original Chesapeake Bay Agreement that the signatories recognized the findings of the Chesapeake Bay program? So how could the findings of the Chesapeake Bay program in 1983 lead to the formation of the Chesapeake Bay program in 1983, right? Doesn't make sense. So like little detail, the Chesapeake Bay program was originally an EPA research study. And in 1983, it evolves into this regional partnership. So as Obi-Wan Kenobi might say, from a certain point of view, yes, the Chesapeake Bay program in its modern form began in 1983. However, I think starting the story in 1983 obscures more than it reveals, which is why I want to push us further back in time to see the origins, to see how we got there, and then we can all move forward together and perhaps get a greater appreciation of what this movement has accomplished. So with that, let's rewind back to 1966 and the creation of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. So I suspect and hope many of you have heard of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. It is the region's largest, wealthiest, biggest staffing environmental nonprofit. It's very influential, nearly ubiquitous in the watershed. And while there are many, many other organizations doing great work on the Chesapeake, and there were a few throughout this history as well, again, for most of the 40, 50 years we're talking about here, CBF was the dominant group and the most important policy player. So I'm going to give them pride of place while acknowledging other groups as well. And again, in the Q&A, feel free to get me off topic, talking more about some of the other organizations involved. So the CBF is really important, but it's also fun. If you think back to that piece of hate mail I showed you, remember Donald DeBoard saying, how do I fight you jerks? I bet you are Democrats. Well, Donnie would have lost that bet. You see, the people who founded CBF were actually Republicans. The key organizational founders were a group of wealthy upper-class white men, mostly from Baltimore and Annapolis. They clustered around the Annapolis Yacht Club. From the research I've done, I've identified most of these people. There was one guy who I couldn't quite figure out what his story was. I'm guessing he was wealthy, otherwise he wouldn't be hanging out at the Annapolis Yacht Club. What you have in this group is a very savvy arrangement of business leaders, cultural leaders, and local politicians. You have a United States congressman, you have the governor of Maryland, Democrat, Republican, and you have some key business leaders in the region. All of this around the yacht club. These guys were sailors. The key figure in this early group was Arthur Sherwood. He was an attorney by training, but think of him more as a gentleman scholar than a practicing attorney. He was very important as a catalyst for bringing these people together from the oral histories I've done and the reading that I've done. Very personable guy, lots of charisma. Certainly he didn't do it himself. This isn't just the Arthur Sherwood story, but he would serve as president of the board. And then after a fun little internal power struggle in 1971, which again, ask me about in the Q&A, he becomes executive director of the organization, which he runs until he retires in 1979. So first decade and a half, Sherwood is a really key figure, one of the most important figures in the Chesapeake Bay's environmental history. Sherwood has an origin story for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation that I've verified. And it's interesting because it reveals a lot about how he saw the world, the responses that CBF generated, and the challenges that the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and other activists faced in getting political leaders to take action for the Bay. As I said, what makes the 1983 moment so important is acknowledgement that Bay was in trouble. Sherwood and his friends were yachtsmen, and while we might portray them in our heads like these kind of like luxurious wine and cheese sipping dudes out on the Bay, they were keen observers of the natural environment. They were fishermen, they were hunters, they saw declining waterfowl populations, they saw development paving over wetlands, they saw runoff from sewage and fish kills. And so they were concerned. Give them credit for it. They were perceptive enough to realize the ecosystem was changing, but what they couldn't get was anyone in the halls of power to take them seriously. So Sherwood's origin story, the superhero story of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, if you will, begins in 1984. And here I'll quote Sherwood from a recollection from 1976. Quote, "In 1964, an Eastern Shore congressman, Rogers C.B. Morton, caught the ear of his neighbors with a disarmingly frank admission that neither he nor the government at large for which he worked should be expected to, quote, solve all the problems of the Chesapeake, unquote, that it was high time for the average citizen to do something for himself. Thus was CBF born. One spark among many ignited. A chance encounter between a public official and his constituents brought a new organization into being." So there's a lot of things I like about this. First, I love how the average citizen is like the yacht club set. It's an interesting view of who the citizenry is at this time, but it reflects the social circles in which Sherwood found himself. The other thing that is interesting is you have a Republican network organizing this movement. Sherwood was a Republican mayoral candidate for Baltimore. Around the same time he was starting CBF, he ran into the buzzsaw of Thomas de Alessandro III, who, just fun footnote, Nancy Pelosi's brother. So imagine how things would have been different if Sherwood had maybe not run into that and gone off and been mayor of Baltimore. But he loses and he devotes his energies to the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. And he's got these connections with Rogers C.B. Morton, who goes on to be a cabinet official under Nixon and Ford and the chair of the RNC. So a big high-powered Republican dude. This doesn't jive with our modern notions of who environmentalists are. We don't think of environmentalists today as being predominantly the yacht club set, wealthy, white, male Republicans. But that's why I think it's so damn important we study our history. There's a lot we can learn from how things were different, who partners were, and how maybe we can build broader, more consensus-driven coalitions moving forward. So let me briefly wrap up CBF's origin story. Despite having a well-connected network of elites on its board of trustees, CBF struggled to convince people there was a problem with the Bay. They had some victories in the early years. They did accomplish a few things, but by and large, there was a lot of pushback from the regional leaders, as we see in this quotation. Morton wasn't necessarily unsupportive of the Bay. He was one of the original 13 trustees of CBF, but he wasn't going to spend a lot of political capital in Congress to get anything done. So while CBF is active, while they do a few things, the movement kind of languishes. It doesn't become a broader, truly grassroots movement until our next watershed moment, which is Tropical Storm Agnes in 1972. If you'll recall what I said earlier when I showed you the satellite imagery of the Chesapeake Bay and its watershed, most of the water comes from Pennsylvania down. And if you look at our rainfall map over here on the right, you can see the worst rainfall fell in the worst possible place for the Chesapeake Bay, right smack dab in the heart of its watershed. Tropical Storm Agnes hit the region like a bullet right between the eyes. You could not have landed such a large volume of water in such a bad place for the estuary. Agnes set 24-hour rainfall records throughout the region, many of which still stand to this day. On the left, I pulled an image from Virginia. That's Richmond. And you can see this was a hell of a lot of water. This was a major, major event. And the flooding that it caused was destructive to human life, to property, billions in damages. It was a fatal storm. But for the Chesapeake Bay, it caused an ecological collapse, especially in parts of the upper bay. All of this rainwater pushed tons and tons of sediment, nutrients into the bay that triggered a collapse in the ecosystem. But you don't have to take my words for it. I have a very, very special source that I'd like to share with you today. 35 years ago, today, this is wonderful, wonderful historical coincidence. February 17th, 1988, three of the greatest figures of Chesapeake science, Eugene Cronin, Donald Pritchard, and William Hargis, gathered at a Chesapeake Bay Foundation Education Center to give a colloquium on Chesapeake science, the history of Chesapeake science, the state of the restoration movement, and their thoughts and prospects for it going forward. So this is in 1988, 35 years ago, and they're already treating the Bay restoration like this long-running thing that needs a historical overview. Tom Horton, who was a legendary environmental journalist for the Baltimore Sun for a long time, happened to be on hand and had just the brilliant sense to say, this feels historic. So he recorded this on VHS. I got a copy of it from him, very, very generous of him. And I'd like to share a few clips with you today. This has since been recorded on VHS 35 years ago, converted to a DVD, put up into the cloud. So apologies that the audio and visuals might not be to our 2023 standards, but I hope you can hear this clearly enough and hear directly from these scientists what happened and why they saw it as so important. So first, Eugene Cronin, again, February 17th, 1988, 35 years ago to this day. Here's Cronin reflecting on Agnes.
One of the more interesting things we went through, the three of us were together at a meeting down in Fredericksburg back in 1972, and it began to rain. And the meeting was flooded out on the ground level, and we moved upstairs, and it rained and rained and rained and rained, and we realized collectively that this was a major event. It hadn't been predicted to be that large, but it was, obviously and clearly. It was Tropical Storm Agnes in 1972 in June, and we recognized that this was going to do tremendous things to the bay. And we decided that the three of us, we'd get out and learn what we could from it. And actually within hours, within a day or two, all three of us had teams on the bay because we were geared up to do the core work largely, but an opportunity. And we learned a tremendous amount from that. We never got paid for it. We're still Still have,
put in jail for it.
didn't get put in jail for it either. We just went ahead and did it.
Wondering how many.
So you'll hear there at the end this joking, we didn't get paid for it. We didn't go to jail for it either. So Cronin and Pritchard and Hargis kind of maybe slightly misused grant funding, but it was for a good cause, right? They had gotten money and boats and staffing to do some other research on the bay. And when Agnes hit, they essentially said, screw it, we have to study this thing. So they got teams out on the water and were able to record this event in real time and see the effect of this huge influx of fresh water on the bay and its ecosystem. And they learned quite a lot from this. And no, they didn't get paid for it. They kind of had to scramble together some funds, didn't go to jail for it either. What I'd like to point out here again, science alone is not enough. Early 1970s, these guys basically figure out what's going on with the bay, and the question becomes translating that science into action. Let me give you one more take from Donald Pritchard about Agnes being this triggering moment that causes this huge decline in the bay's water quality.
Long a year like Agnes.
There I am trying to check the chat, messing up my video. I'm going to let the video play and not try to do two things at once.
Between 50 and 100 years worth of sediment came in, and nutrients came in to the Chesapeake Bay with Agnes.
That's right kind of window.
Right. And not only from that end, but also all of the rivers were high. They were high in Virginia. But the biggest input was from the upper bay with the storm passing up. When you get that much of a load upon a slowly changing system, suddenly you trigger, it's stress, and you trigger that reaction. Now, I don't say that everybody agrees completely with this concept of Agnes being the trigger, but it was certainly a trigger. It was certainly part of the process, because this was June 28th, 1972. And as Gene said,
So again, maybe not the trigger, but certainly a trigger where you have population growth in the watershed, increasing intensification of agriculture, and stressing the system, massive influx of water degrades the bay. And for me, this is really the most important turning point in the ecological history of the region, because much of the restoration work has been trying to reverse the damage done by Agnes over these past 50 years. I do want to quickly point out, I've privileged the scientists because they were important and I have these great resources, but the working watermen of the Chesapeake Bay saw this too. I have a quote here from Larry Sims from his memoir, The Best of Times on the Chesapeake Bay. Sims was the president of the Maryland Watermen's Association for 40 years, so he's a great authority on this subject. And we have a wonderful recollection from him. He gives a great narrative retelling of riding out Agnes on the bay in his workboat, up all night, hoping the thing doesn't flood. And then he comes back and he says, on the first morning back, I was relieved the physical damage was less than expected. So far, I felt our community could weather the aftermath. I had seen lots of fresh water before, so I wasn't too worried. Up until 1972, the Chesapeake Bay had always had the capacity and strength to bounce back. On my second day on dry land, I no longer felt optimistic. By my third day on dry land, the full aftermath of Tropical Storm Agnes was clearly visible to anyone who chose to see it. So you have, in 1972, the damage to the bay, the beginnings of a scientific understanding, and yet it still takes us almost more than a decade to get from 1972 to 1983. The key piece, and I've got one more clip from Cronin before we move on, is this idea of science by crisis, response by crisis. I want to share this because I think it's really important to understanding a recurring theme in the Chesapeake's history, but in environmental histories elsewhere, which is even if scientists are sounding the alarm and resource users are sounding the alarm and activists are waving their hands, it's not until you get that crisis that you get a response. So once more, Eugene Cronin, from 35 years ago to the day.
else in the scientific community would call attention to a problem or a potential problem, and nothing changed. When there's a crisis, there's a mortality, when the fish die or the crabs are in serious shortage, as they have been and will be again, or when there's an oyster mortality or some other problem comes up, suddenly there's an interest. Suddenly somebody is willing to give you some money to do the things you've been wishing to, proposing to do for decades, maybe. And as long as the problem lasts, you can get funding.
Science by crisis. and
Science by
management
crisis.
Crisis.
Response by crisis, and it's still much too prevalent in my person.
So science by crisis, response by crisis. The crisis of Tropical Storm Agnes awakens the region to the problems facing the Chesapeake Bay. Using CBF's membership data as a rough proxy for support in the region, you can see they start to really grow after 1973. The organization was stuck in neutral for the first half decade of its existence. In 1975, Senator Mathias, Republican from Maryland, helped shepherd through some appropriations for the EPA to study this problem. Essentially, a very large, elaborate political theater research to verify and expand upon what Hargis, Cronin, Pritchard already knew. The Bay was in trouble, but getting the science in a political, theatrical way to do it. As the EPA starts doing this research, they start releasing reports. And here again, I'll make this point one last time. If you zoom in, Chesapeake Bay program, technical studies, a synthesis. The date on that, I know you can't make it out because it's blurry. The date is September 1982. So as if I haven't, beaten this point into the ground enough, Chesapeake Bay program in its current form begins in 1983, but the actual original Chesapeake Bay program as an EPA study begins in 1975 in the wake of Tropical Storm Agnes. And it's part of this growing groundswell of concern for the Bay, because while they're studying it, it's getting worse and it's getting worse and it's getting worse. And as we hit the 1980s, which is a decade we don't associate with environmental activism, in the Chesapeake region, it took off. The Chesapeake Bay Foundation begins an explosive exponential growth phase, which coincides with Ronald Reagan's election. So despite expectations of people like Donald DeBoard, Reagan takes care of environmentalists by helping launch the Chesapeake Bay program, directing the EPA to continue this work and helping give rise to the Chesapeake Bay program as we know it, something that has grown into big government spending involving multiple states and the federal government. So it's a fun little historical irony, but a reminder that popular pressure can still make politicians do things. I'm an optimist on these things. So after the Chesapeake Bay Agreement is signed, we're back now to where we started. We've come back to the middle of our story. The Bay does start to get a little bit better. There are a few wins. There's money being spent. One of the big wins is saving striped bass. There's a rockfish ban. Maryland plays a key role. Virginia plays a key role. There are phosphate bans. There's attempts for sewage. So there's some progress. But the movement stalls. Again, using CBF membership data as a proxy for what's going on regionally. I've got lots of other things backing this up, but this is a quick shorthand. You can see by the 90s, momentum starts to flag. This period of growth fades. And as we reach the mid to late 90s, CBF membership declines. If you look at the legislation and the policies being passed, everyone is on the defensive. There are Chesapeake Bay Foundation publications which characterize this time as simply holding the line, playing defense, trying to prevent the worst of the worst from coming to pass. So what changes? What gets the movement back on track after hitting this wall? A combination of movement fatigue for fighting hard for these, truly almost 30 years by this point, a combination of encountering increased hostility from a new breed of conservatives as the Mathiases retire from the scene, as the Rogers Mortons retire from the scene, and they get replaced by your Newt Gingrich types or your Governor Allens down in Virginia. You have more resistance to environmentalism and more resistance to environmental protection. You have popular attention waning, getting directed elsewhere. So what happens? Science by crisis, response by crisis. In 1997, one of the weirdest things to strike the region happens. It sounds like something ripped from the pages of a Michael Crichton novel. The cell from hell, Pfisteria fastidia, literally meaning in Latin, the fish killer. This is an invisible, shape-shifting menace capable of killing its victims in a horrifyingly gruesome fashion by melting the flesh off its bones. Although it sounds fictional, Pfisteria was quite real. It's a dinoflagellate. They are microorganisms, so invisible. They're capable through their complex life cycle of transforming from plant-like organisms to animal-like organisms, so shape-shifting. And indeed, in one of their life cycle stages, they produce a powerful biotoxin that can dissolve living tissue. So yeah, battery acid-powered thing from hell. Pfisteria was a really strange and mysterious phenomenon to strike the region, and it spawned a lot of sensationalist reporting, including books like And the Waters Turn to Blood, where the author claims Pfisteria, quote, may become the ultimate biological threat. The fictional novel Sea Change, in which a Pfisteria-like organism threatens to obliterate Seattle, and the really popular novel The Swarm, where Pfisteria is one key component of the larger effort by the ocean to wipe out humanity for our sins. You know, like dramatic stuff, Pfisteria, hysteria. Now, in the region, there were some people who kept their heads and analyzed this from like a sober scientific mentality, but this was a media sensation. And one of the ironies is for all the damage that was done, for all the reports that were written, for all the pages of ink, Pfisteria has so far been a one-off phenomenon. It happened once in a really bad way. It scared a lot of people because it was mysterious. It was unknown. There were some humans who were sickened. Some watermen working on the eastern shore of Maryland described having some neurological damage from this. But unlike nutrient pollution and the effects of Tropical Storm Agnes, Pfisteria has not been an ongoing ecological problem for the Bay. But it was capable of galvanizing another round of political action, in part because even though this was just a one-time threat to the Bay, a conservative estimate of the financial impact of Pfisteria just for the summer of 1997 was at least $250 million lost to the seafood, tourism, and dining industries of Maryland and Virginia. So even if you are a Republican governor or state senator or congressman who's a bit disinclined to believe the environmentalists, $250 million economic hit is something you are going to pay attention to. So even as this crisis was unfolding and in its aftermath, people saw a potential silver lining. William Baker, who was the president of CBF after Sherwood until his retirement in 2021, so just a year and a half ago. Back in 1997, Baker said that Pfisteria was, quote, a metaphor for all that is wrong with the Bay. In the response to Pfisteria, Baker and others said, this is a symbol. This is a really powerful, potent political symbol of what's wrong. They acknowledged the real issues have to do with nutrient pollution and sediments and chicken farms in the eastern shore of Maryland and cattle farms up in Pennsylvania and hog and poultry industries down in Virginia. But Pfisteria was the thing that could get people's attention and galvanize understanding around this issue. As a result, not unlike Agnes 25 years earlier, there's a crisis and a response. In this case, it's Chesapeake 2000. Chesapeake 2000 was a really ambitious, though somewhat naive attempt to list all the problems with the Bay and commit people to solving them. I don't want to go through this one by one because there's a lot in this document. It's more than just a one pager will do something. They have admirably at the time put in some ambitious goals, including things related to restricting land use. This was a big contentious issue to reduce sprawl, to plant forests, to restore underwater vegetation, to protect crabs, to protect oysters. And by and large, this document did not meet its goals. There were some wins. Turns out it's easy to plant forests. You can get money for that. If you plant a tree, they tend to do well. Turns out it's very hard for underwater grasses. The Chesapeake Bay Foundation got a lot of money to plant underwater grasses, but they found out that until the water quality issues get resolved, you're just wasting your money to put grasses into places where they won't get enough light because of sediment pollution. Oysters is another bright spot that's tended to do well. It took oysters a long time to start to recover, but the oyster restoration initiatives have been something to see, especially in the last few years. Crabs, a bit different. They were looking good for a while. Now they're not so good, but I don't want to get too caught up into the play-by-play of where we currently are. What I want to say is this fits an existing pattern of problem, fatigue, collapse, new problem, restarts again. So how do you break this cycle of science by crisis, response by crisis? Well, the people who've been working on this for a long time, scientists, resource users, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, realized that the missing ingredient during these 40, 45 years has been the federal government. And that's what's going to take center stage in our final watershed moment in just a bit. But before I get there, I want to remind you, when we talked about Arthur Sherwood and the superhero origin story of the Chesapeake Bay, it was this response from a federal official saying the average citizen needs to do something about this. So for 40 years, 45 years, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and other advocacy groups worked at the margins of the federal government. Obviously, the EPA was involved. I showed you clips of Reagan. I'm not saying the federal government was excluded, but this joint federal-state partnership was really led by the states. Even today, the states collectively spend much more money on the Bay than the federal government does. Arguably, that's fine. The states benefit from it, so they should have some skin in the game. But it's only been recently that Uncle Sam has surpassed Maryland as the single largest funder. And when you consider the Chesapeake Bay as a resource of national, international significance, when you consider how difficult it is to overcome state feuding, you see that the federal government needed to have a larger role sooner to make this restoration work. So by the mid-2000s, many observers realized this system of agreements and promises isn't working because there's no one to hold the various parties of the Chesapeake Bay program accountable. So enter our final turning point, the EPA's TMDL consent decree. And just coincidentally, they happen to use the exact same font I'm using. So as I was putting this together, I thought, did the EPA just use Microsoft PowerPoint for their format? Whatever, who knows, just interesting. I had the chance to interview John Mueller, CBF's vice president for litigation way back in 2012, and he told me some of the origin story for this idea of suing the EPA to enforce the Clean Water Act under this provision called a total maximum daily load. The idea is you can scientifically establish a pollution diet for the Bay, and if states aren't meeting that under the Clean Water Act, you can threaten to remove funding. So in theory, there's a legislative or legal stick to compel action. But this stick actually relied on these successive agreements. It built upon these 40 years of getting people to agree there's a problem and agree we should do something about it. But let me let John Mueller explain in his own words. And this one might be a little bit louder because it was a more recent recording with a proper device. So apologies if I blast your eardrums, but you should hear this one just fine.
Those basic elements. I looked at the Chesapeake Bay agreements and I said, these were signed by government officials all saying we're going to do X, and the public reads those things and so, well, great, they're going to do X and it's really going to fix the Bay, which is exactly what I want them to do. 10 years go by, they don't do it. They write another agreement, same thing. Don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, but they keep signing these agreements. And I analyzed it to, if you and I sign a contract with a bank for a house, and I willingly say, I'm going to, pay you this money. And if I don't pay you the money, then the bank gets to come take the house away from me. Why is it that we can't turn to our elected officials and say, you signed this document saying you were going to do X by this date and you didn't do it? So I did a lot of research to kind of get into this interstate compact theory in which, states basically contracted with the federal government to clean up the Bay, and they weren't doing it. And so we alleged that theory in our complaint. Now, it was never ruled on by a court, so I don't know, would it have withstood judicial scrutiny, but it certainly was a new legal theory that we were pressing. And
so 2 quick points before I wrap us up into conclusion mode. First, the various Chesapeake Bay agreements have been criticized because of their voluntary nature and because they kept failing. And I don't want to totally dismiss those criticisms, but as a historian, I want to suggest these were necessary building blocks to establishing this framework of repeated promises to the people of the region to do something about the Bay. If you had tried to go with a legalistic approach earlier, it might have failed. It could have succeeded. Historical counterfactuals are really hard. You play with fire if you go down that road. So I'll stick with what happened. A framework of agreement after agreement after agreement over 45 years that didn't work allowed Mueller and CBF and their allies, including Bernie Fowler of Maryland, including some others, to sue the EPA. The irony here is they filed that lawsuit in the waning days of the George Bush administration, and it fell upon the incoming Obama administration to deal with this. And yet it still took them 18 months to iron out a consent decree where the EPA agreed to establish a total maximum daily load and enforce it. The second point, so first point, these agreements matter. Second point, my talk with Mueller was in 2012. At that point, there was litigation pending on this consent decree. After the EPA agreed to it, secretaries or attorneys general from a variety of conservative states, the American Farm Bureau Federation, National Association of Realtors, all challenged this because they had economic or ideological grounds against what the EPA was trying to do. The fear was, if you can establish a TMDL for something like the Chesapeake Bay, good Lord, what happens if you make a TMDL for, oh, I don't know, the Mississippi River, right? You could potentially extend the long arm of the government across the whole country. So this is a super important piece of environmental law and environmental policy. Now, you couldn't just turn around and make a TMDL anywhere. Part of why this works is that history of regional efforts to try to restore the bay. But in the years since I interviewed Mueller in 2012, this withstood circuit and appellate court challenges. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. After the U.S. Court of Appeals, the plaintiffs asked the Supreme Court to review this case, and this happened to coincide with that fun little window where the court was deadlocked 4-4, and Mitch McConnell wasn't allowing a replacement. So with the court deadlocked 4-4, the 4 liberal justices said, we don't need to review this, the case is good. The 4 conservative justices said, we should review this, and because it's a deadlock, lower court ruling stands. So long story short, the EPA consent decree has been upheld and it has become the guiding framework. So this is where my story ends. But to bring us full circle, I argue that as a result of this long history, finally reaching a point where through the force of law, the federal government is compelled to take a leadership role, we're in a new era of policy framework. The past, since 2010, right? So 12, 13 years, we're in a new era and you can see it. Politically and financially, this has been a clear success. From Obama to Trump to Biden, from Republican governors and Democratic senators, throughout a lot of political ups and downs the past 10 years, funding for the Bay has remained at a much higher level than it was pre-2010. So something significant really did change. We are in a new policy landscape that has directed more resources towards the Bay than ever before, and that's good. However, we're stuck with this thorny issue of the Bay not recovering. 2 of the more high-profile Chesapeake Bay report cards, one from CBF, one from our friends at the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, both give the Bay middling grades. CBF gives it a D-, the Maryland Center a C. Chesapeake Progress, run by the Bay program, gives us a mixed record. You can point to things that are more positive. I think in a big way, the water quality standards are off track, and that's very concerning. I don't want to diminish the fact that climate change hangs over this whole thing and could threaten to undo a lot of good work. But what I do want to say is, as a historian, I still see this as fairly recent. 2010 was not that long ago, and yet a lot's happened, and this has proven to be an enduring, durable political coalition. I happen to be an optimist. I believe that with continued input of resources, the Bay can continue to improve. I think we have to think about this as an example of sustainability and think about it the way we would a education system or a public health system or a military. You don't just spend money once and expect it to be perpetuating. If you want this amazing ecosystem to continue to persevere in the face of a lot of human pressure, it's going to require continuous investment. And many, many other authors and scholars have made the point that, yeah, the Chesapeake Bay is something valuable and worth investing in. So I won't belabor that point here. Instead, let me just conclude with a proper historical overview. In 1966, in the face of growing population pressure and an explicitly disinterested, uninterested federal government, a popular movement began and grew into a regional force by working with scientists and resource users to implement policies that have helped to sustain the Chesapeake as a place capable of evoking all the wonder and magic of nature while still supporting age-old ways of living off the land and water. This is a tremendous achievement, one we should celebrate. So I hope a deeper understanding of how much we've achieved and the obstacles we've overcome will inspire us to face the challenges ahead. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was amazing. I'm sure that everyone's applauding on mute. Thank you for your really comprehensive view of those topics. And I hope, okay, good. We've got a hand up, maybe a couple hands up for questions. I'm just going to go from who I can see first. Ruth, will you either unmute and say your question or put your question in the chat?
Great presentation. I was just clapping.
Oh, you were clapping. I'm sorry. Okay. So the way I'd like to do this is, okay, we do have a hand up. Jess, go ahead.
Hi, yes. Thank you, Andrew, for this presentation. I learned a lot. And as someone who grew up with the Bay in my backyard, I grew up on Virginia's Northern Neck in Reedville, Virginia. So I know it very intimately, but I think this is a great catch up to kind of learn some of that history that maybe predated me. I now live in St. Louis, Missouri, along the Mississippi River. And I've done I'm an architect and a lecturer at Washington University in St. Louis, lecturer of architecture. And I'm kind of interested in spatial proximity. I've done a lot of watershed research on the Mississippi River and others. And I'm wondering about your take on the physical proximity of DC and the federal government existing within the Chesapeake Bay watershed and how that might play out. I mean, you touched briefly on what it could mean for the federal government to get involved in policy such as this and how that might be precedents for elsewhere in the US. I guess I'm just kind of interested on your take, or if you have other examples of how this could play out outside of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. I'm all for the Chesapeake Bay watershed restoration, of course, but I'm kind of thinking about that idea of spatial proximity.
Yeah, absolutely. Bonus points, Jess, for picking up on that, because this is a huge dynamic. What Chesapeake advocates are able to do, I mentioned earlier, Sherwood was a yacht guy. So during 1983, one of the things that the Chesapeake Bay Foundation did was they got Senator Mathias of Maryland to invite some other officials out, for a cruise. You can take these people out on the bay. And there's some very savvy, oh, we're going to sail around and we're going to have some oysters and some wine. And wouldn't it be great if we protected this thing in perpetuity? So that proximity really mattered. Lots of these officials from across the US live in the region, live in DC. It's right on the Potomac. Those things were really easy to see and to show. So that spatial proximity mattered, but not just for DC. One of the aspects I didn't have enough time to highlight in my formal presentation was the growth of this as a watershed-wide movement. One of the leading factors is the Chesapeake Bay Foundation's education program. The way that the Chesapeake Bay Foundation cracked the nut of Pennsylvania was by taking students on field trips in Pennsylvania. And initially they tried to bring students from PA down to the Bay, and that was cool and all, go see the crabs, go see the oysters, spend a night on an island, but it didn't make the connection to their home waters. So it was taking students on canoes on the Conegawinet outside Harrisburg or on the Juniata, where they could see the value of having good forest buffers for their trout streams that made these connections. So that spatial place really matters. And I've got some great charts of showing how the Bay Foundation's education program grew to this watershed-wide thing and how membership from different parts of the region followed. It's true in a lot of areas. I think one of the challenges is getting people to experience the environment. At the beginning, back in the 60s, there were lots of scientists, watermen, yacht club guys who saw the problems, but they couldn't convey at scale to a large chunk of the population that the bay was stressed until Agnes comes along and just cuts things down. Outside of the watershed, I do think there's a similar dynamic. How do you get legislators from Congress to care about what's happening in Mississippi, in St. Louis? It's a real challenge, but I hope that when we look at some of the tools available with drones, with mapping, with 3D imaging, we can try to decrease our reliance here. I started off my talk by making fun of I'm a historian at a tech school, but I do love technology. And I do think we should figure out how we can use that to make the environment more understandable and more knowable. That's one of the big challenges, because when you know the environment, you can see it. I'll wrap up briefly, but I'll say in Maryland, at least, there's a environmental literacy requirement. I know education is always a flashpoint for these issues, but having at a high school or even middle elementary school level, a requirement for students to go out and have outdoor experiences can be really powerful in incubating a understanding and appreciation for nature at a young age. Does that answer your question? Awesome. Thank you, Jess. That was a great question. I saw in the chat earlier, I'm just going to quickly
rip. Me to read that for you?
Oh, no. I saw it. So David
Okay.
Powers asked, in short, what lessons from the Chesapeake Bay movement might we transfer to our actions on climate change? I got this question from a student of mine a couple of years ago, and we had a great debate. I essentially argued, I think the various climate protocols are part of this long-standing process. I see a lot of parallels. It's frustrating. We sign these climate accords. We're going to cap it at 2 degrees Celsius, and we're going to miss that, right? It's going to get warmer than that. But I think that if we remember, it's not just science, right? I showed you that little tagline, a better bay through better science. We're not going to solve climate change through science alone. We're not going to solve it through business alone. I think acknowledging something as political theater doesn't totally strip it of meaning and value. It just helps us better understand what value we're getting. So I think one of the parallels is, yeah, it can be really frustrating to assemble year after year and have our elected leaders from around the world, or maybe not so elected, make these pledges for climate change and then not follow through. I would argue, as the glass half full guy, that there's tremendous value in the political theater of forcing these really powerful leaders to acknowledge a problem and at least say they'll do something, because then it gives you the thinnest glimmer of hope that you can actually hold them accountable for doing that. And holding people accountable requires a big popular movement and a little bit of luck. But you'd be in a much, much worse place if people weren't acknowledging those problems and weren't making any kind of move towards it. So I'm not going to give you an easy solution for climate change here. I don't think history gives us canned lessons quite that simply. I wish it did, but it doesn't. But I do think we can see some parallels, and as frustrating as it is, I think we can draw some hope from, like, every year, the next COP meeting, let's force people to show up and commit to this and keep committing to it, and we'll keep nudging that ball further and further towards the goal line.
Thanks, Andrew. I had a question that pertains to my own research into cities and sea level rise in the Chesapeake. You talk a lot about states' engagement and the federal engagement with the Bay. How do you see cities participating in these issues, not just in relation to pollution, but also other issues like sea level rise?
Yeah, that's a great question, Luke. Thanks for asking. I think cities have a huge role to play. And you're right, I focused a lot on the states and the federal government in my talk and in my research, but there's a lot that cities are doing. I think at one basic level, infrastructure here really matters. One of the big wins on improving water quality in the Chesapeake Bay has been sewage infrastructure, and spending lots and lots of money to build new sewage plants, upgrade them. These are things that cities can advocate for, city leaders, the residents can advocate and lobby for, and those can be pretty easy wins. People who might be opposed to environmentalism might not be so opposed to a construction project that creates jobs, and, oh, by the way, is also going to help with the smell of the runoff. Here in Pittsburgh, we have a lot of combined sewers, and it is an ongoing issue affecting water quality in our region, where you get a little bit of rain and you've got a combined sewer overflow. So major issue there. I think cities also can be really productive sites of engaging with the environment. Think Norfolk, think Baltimore, think DC. You've got people clustered near nature, and appreciating the urban environment and cities' relationship with these estuaries is really important. Around the world, most of our major cities are located on estuaries. One of my larger projects as a historian, as an environmental historian, is reminding people of how important coastal ecosystems are. Environmental history as a subdiscipline kind of grew out of a concern with Western issues and national parks and pristine lands and commodities out west and resource extraction. Oh yeah, I'm seeing email address. Let me pop that. I'm unfortunately search engine optimized. The powers that be have made it very easy to find me online. So if you Google Andrew Ramey, you'll find me. But my email is aramey@andrew.cmu.edu, and I would love to hear from you. Come down and visit sometime. I've got family in the region and obviously research interests there. Anyway, but to answer your question, Luke, I think cities have a lot to do in introducing people to the environment, and through their infrastructure, helping mitigate some of the harms. I also think if we want to reduce harmful sprawl and reduce the rate at which wetlands and forests and riparian buffers are being turned into subdivisions, reinvesting in our cities and making them really attractive places to live, work, and play is super important. It is a win-win. Make affordable housing in the cities. You will help the environment. You will help people. You'll help our communities. It feels like a no-brainer, but it's also a hard thing to pull off. Your second question about climate change, I want to touch on or sea level rise in particular, I want to touch on briefly. I think the easy answer is it's going to be bad, and that's a right answer. Rising sea levels is going to increase erosion of wetlands, is going to threaten habitat loss. But we do have this science by crisis dynamic that I've shown, and Agnes and Visteri were both bad, but they had silver linings that allowed policymakers to respond to public pressure and have maybe a permission structure for doing so. So I don't want to just be like, oh, it'll be great when there's a flooding disaster. But I do think a simplistic narrative of it's just going to be terrible and everything's going to be bad will obscure opportunities to say, here's a problem. We now know this is a problem and we can do it. The good news is I don't think there are technical, I mean, I'm not an architect, I'm not an urban planner, but my sense is the issue is not that the technical expertise to deal with these problems is beyond us. It's a political issue. It's a political capital, social capital issue, not a technological issue. So if I'm wrong, please correct me. I'm here to learn from people who aren't historians. But I do think for as gloomy as the future can be, there's still silver linings to these dark clouds if we're able to seize on them and present them and tell these narratives in ways that encourage people to see a positive role for themselves as being part of a movement that is effective and successful and can continue to generate good outcomes, not just for a natural environment, but for people. I'm sort of rambling here, but let me make one final point, and I'd love to hear other questions. What I find so compelling about studying the Chesapeake is it's never been a pristine nature debate. There have been moments where, hey, we shouldn't build near Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge. Let's keep that as one of the last bald cypress swamps on the East Coast. Fine. But by and large, the issue with the Chesapeake is not about preserving this ecosystem from the destructive hand of man. It's been about figuring out how can we accommodate farmers and developers and fishers and watermen, both recreational and commercial and sporting. How do we accommodate those with the essential functioning of the ecosystem? Right? This is the great question of the 21st century. How do we allow people to do the economic activity they need to do to generate all the things we love and need while still keeping the functioning aspects of this ecosystem afloat? It is a major, major challenge. And I do think that with the Chesapeake, there are some encouraging signs and lessons we can take from it, many, many caveats acknowledged.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Y'all, we are at 1:07. I believe we have this Zoom until 1:15, so don't be shy. Feel free to raise your hand, speak up, unmute. We'd love to hear from you. And if there are no further, oh, Bernardo, go ahead.
Well, I was about to say, while people fight their shyness and come up with good questions, I have perhaps a bit of a broader question, not directly related to the Chesapeake Bay, but the fields that you're working on or working in, namely environmental history. And how do you distinguish environmental history from landscape history? And is it even reasonable to try to make that kind of distinction?
That's an interesting question. I am kind of a big tent guy. I don't know if you remember, like, people would be in relationships and be like, oh, why do I have to give it a label? I don't know if you're my boyfriend or my girlfriend, no labels. So I'm kind of a no labels guy. I think we should be lowering our disciplinary silos instead of raising them. So this is maybe an oblique answer to your question. What I love about history is it is one of the most lowercase d democratic disciplines. Almost anyone can be a historian and engage in historical research. Doesn't mean it's easy or trivial, but the comparison I like to point out, here at Carnegie Mellon Tech School is if you want to do some serious research in physics, good luck getting time at the Large Hadron Collider. Good luck with that. If you want to do serious research in history, go to the Library of Congress, go to the National Archives. It's there. It's open. It's ours to the public. History is ours. It's our shared thing. So my oblique answer to your question is I see a lot of overlap between landscape history and environmental history. If you were really insisting on drawing some lines in the sand, I think maybe environmental history is a bit broader. When we think about environments, we include landscapes, but we also include airsheds, watersheds, hydrological systems. One of my teaching schemas that I use is there's 3 ways to think about environmental history. The first is like natural history of the environment and the constraints it places on humans. So like you can only grow sugar in certain parts of the world. Same with cotton. That explains social development and agricultural systems and systems of exploitation around the world, right? So there's one level of just what's happening naturally. There's a second level, which is the reciprocal relationships between humans and nature. We choose to plant sugar in a particular region because it's favorable for sugar, and then we start importing labor from Africa, and that creates a whole host of problems, but it also creates ecological change. In the New World, you get yellow fever and malaria imported, and you create these disease environments. You also create pests. You bring in pesticides. There's an ongoing back and forth. So this reciprocal nature between people and the environment, including the land, including the water, including commodities and living resources, back and forth through time. The third and final layer is how we think about it. So what makes environmental history history and not ecology or geology? Sidebar, I have a great friend who's a geologist. He teases me all the time. He says, how much history do you study? I'm like, I don't know, 100 years. He says, my late course, I've got 10 million years of history. So he teases me about that. But what makes history history is not the depth of time you have, but the exploration of the human mind and the way that we think and organize our societies in response to these environmental pressures. So looking at how people perceive the value of planting sugar in a particular part of the world is something that's worth doing and fighting over and oppressing people for, how they justify that. There's an environmental history there. So these 3 layers, sort of nature itself, reciprocal relations, and how people think about it. That's how I conceive of environmental history and how others do, but history is a contested discipline. Different historians will give you different answers to that question. Was that helpful?
Yes, it was. And during your talk, and just highlighting now in this brief answer to my question, something that I've realized is my background is as a landscape architect, and in our PhD program here at UVA, the program runs across the 4 departments. So it's architecture, landscape architecture, architectural history, and urban planning. And it's astonishing to hear you speaking and identifying yourself as an historian and working in history, but you could say that you're a landscape architect working within landscape architecture, because it's exactly the same kind of discourse that we analyze and that we use. So I'm up for lowering or getting rid of the silos of the fields that we work in, and realizing that we're talking about the built environment or the constructed environment, and we're all contributing in different ways, but talking about the same objects and fields with similar approaches. So thank you. This was really interesting.
Yeah, I completely agree. I was so excited when Luke invited me to talk to your group for that very reason. I see a lot of similarities, and I think there's a lot of lessons we can draw from history, particularly environmental history, because it asks so many urgent questions about our relationship with the world around us, both how we conceptualize it, how systems of power and oppression work through that. There's a great quote. I wish I could remember who actually said it, but it's something to the effect of exploitation of nature is nothing other than exploitation of people through nature. And I'm probably butchering the gist of that quote, but this idea that when we're talking about environmental harm, it's important to remember we're also talking about systems of power and social harm and inequalities. It's part of it too. You can't exclude people when you're looking at exploitation of nature and natural resources.
Thanks so much, Andrew and Bernardo. We are about out of time. Do we have anyone else who wants to jump in with a question before we give Andrew a big Zoom round of applause? Going once. And of course, he has his email in the chat. So for anyone who wants to ask further questions, feel free. I think Andrew is ready to hear what you've got to say. So, well, thanks so much, Andrew. That was great.